Okay, Amos, start over again.
Okay, so I have a new category of arguments for theism, which I'm going to launch for the first time on Justin Crumit's YouTube channel. So, um, the argument goes like this. Okay, it's easiest to introduce with a case. So imagine you're a radical rights-based libertarian. So you believe in the non-aggression principle and you believe in very stringent property rights. Okay, and suppose you also think that for conceptually independent reasons, it just so happens that when you implement the non-aggression principle in society, that will result in the best economic consequences and like best in terms of human flourishing. Okay. So it seems like on this view, there's a sort of striking coincidence between the moral facts and then like coinciding empirical facts. And conceptually, there's no reason why these things should pair up. And so initially, when you find out you have you have one of these sort of like suspiciously convenient ideologies like rights-based libertarianism, you should update in favor of thinking that you've gotten to this belief by way of motivated reasoning. But suppose you go back to the drawing board and you reread your Murray Rothbard and you're like, oh, yikes, that these beliefs really were well justified. Okay, then what I think you should do is update in favor of theism or some other value selection hypothesis. On theism, there's like a fairly plausible story of why God wouldn't annoyingly constitute human beings such that like the only way to make them flourish would be to violate their rights on a wide scale and vice versa. And so you might think, okay, maybe that works, but not for many other views besides libertarianism. But I think I haven't like come to a sort of decisive list, but I think there are just going to be lots of suspiciously convenient ideologies like this that people have, where like there could end up being a similar update, where like at first you should think that you got here by motivated reasoning, but on reflection, if you decide the beliefs are well justified, you should update instead in favor of theism or some other value selection hypothesis. So like one example that doesn't assume deontology is like veganism. So lots of people lots of vegans have the view that that morality requires that we not kill animals for food. But as it happens, a vegan diet is both the best diet for the planet and for human health. Okay, and you might think, okay, there's no reason why these things needed to pair up. So that's a suspiciously convenient ideology. But it turns out all of these things are true, and so you should update in favor of theism. I think Justin will be able to like chip in on this. I don't know much about like Republican political philosophy generally, but like presumably not all of it is consequentialized, and there might be some sort of like deontological principles of non-domination where like there are some Republicans who think that non-domination is bad for non-consequentialist reasons. Um, and so they'll think, okay, justice requires a society in which domination is reduced. But then there's a good chance they'll also think that as it happens when we build a society like this will result in human flourishing measured on a bunch of like conceptually independent metrics. And there are just going to be like tons and tons of so I don't know, like morality requires that businesses be worker cooperatives, and as it happens, these businesses are much more effective in other businesses in the marketplace. Or like you might think that if corporal punishment, capital punishment, and torture were effective, then they would be permissible. People who think that are more likely to think that these things, in fact, like are effective, and also that they're permissible. And so that's a convenient matchup. And there are lots of ideologies like this. And my claim is that if you reflect on these ideologies and you think, yikes, all of the beliefs that surprisingly cohere together are in fact true, then you should update in favor of theism to some degree.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean I guess it has a similar structure to the point you find in like Kant and Sidgwick about the supposed alignment between morality and rational self-interest, where it's this Kantian thought that like, oh, if behaving morally doesn't in the end lead you to flourish, then we have some sort of contradiction in practical reason or something. Oh, so it must be that God exists and has caused these things to align. Yeah, except here it's, well, there's, if you believe in this, yeah, if you believe in this coincidence between morality and these other good results or whatever, um, then that's like a suspicious coincidence that's better explained by theism.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it depends on I guess it depends on like how good. Yeah, maybe there are a couple of things to say. I mean, the issues on which it's like obviously successful, like the Rothbard view, the problem is just that those views are like nuts. Um,
yeah.
but
But like,
yeah,
so you might think like some libertarian views aren't like as nuts. So you might think, okay, this probably works for just like regular rights-based libertarianism, or
yeah,
like Hume's libertarianism or Dan Muller's libertarianism, where like that's not
yeah,
rights-based, but there's a different moral consider. And like you might think those are nuts, but they're less nuts and more widely adhered to than Rothbard's theory
yeah,
among smart people.
yeah. So I guess it will depend on it will depend on the specific view, and maybe it will depend on some combination of like how plausible is it that this isn't just motivated reasoning, and how plausible is it that it really is just coincidence. I mean, in some cases, there might be some reason why good things go together that doesn't require an
Mhm.
extrinsic whatever. And then like uh what are the like hits and misses when we think about cases where there are these things where the world seems to be set up such that you do have to do things that are prima facie wrong because of the consequences otherwise sometimes or whatever.
Yeah,
Or if you're a strong deontologist, you are forbidden from doing things that would be for the best, by strong deontology or whatever. So we need, if there's like some coincidence, sometimes it's not so bad, but then I mean, it's not so suspicious, but then we have, well, what about war where sometimes the right thing to do involves killing civilians as collateral damage or, whatever, right? Or even
yeah,
even in the context of veganism, I guess you do kill all sorts of animals just in the context of ordinary food production, and we sort of figure, well, that's unavoidable, unfortunately, and so it's okay. Or so that's kind of my first pass is that we need to
yeah.
work out those things.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
Sure. Yeah, like there's a lot to be worked out. I mean, I guess the thought would be, okay, the evidence could be better if it was like a more tight correlation between the demands of
right.
morality and good consequences. But like you might think, okay, there's just this sort of broad structural correlation, at least in some areas. Like the most impressive ones are probably going to be the correlations between like human welfare and the demands of justice. Like if in
Yeah.
general you think that like whatever your political philosophy is, the demands of justice aren't conceptually tied to human welfare, and like in fact like the demands of justice and human welfare nicely coincide, then I think that'll be some evidence for theism because there's this sort of broad structural correlation. And
Yeah.
then like the stuff where there's not, that's just like the problem of evil again. And so if you have
Yeah.
some theodicy that like doesn't prevent theism from making predictions at all, then I think that's what you need.
yeah, I think I'm not very sold on this argument. I mean, first of all, it seems like the kind of thing where you would like it seems almost like sort of like conspiratorial reasoning where the world has a lot of things that might converge, and so it wouldn't be hard to find one or two and then to claim that they're suspicious, particularly when they're exactly the types of things that we would expect to be favored by motivated reasoning. And then
Mhm.
I think I don't find most of these to be that impressive. Um, and I think there are all sorts of cases where it goes in exactly the opposite direction. So, for example, take the fact that among animal products that you eat, it tends to be the ones that are better for the environment that are worse for animal welfare. Um, that are worse
Like
for
with
animal welfare,
chicken.
right? Tend to be worse for health. And then so I agree. Like imagine there were like maybe like suppose with veganism there were like 13 different upsides and they all converged. Maybe that would be impressive. but there are like
Mhm.
4 things going in one direction and then one thing going in another direction where it's like they're good for health, good veganism is good for health, good for animals, good for the environment, and maybe like good for disease or something. Though that won't be independent of being good for health, right? So it's maybe like,
Yeah.
and then so if we assume that
I guess like good for like good as nutrition and good from this perspective of like minimizing pandemic risk or whatever. I mean, those both fall under the rubric of good for health,
yeah,
but they are like
yeah, I guess,
yeah.
but I wouldn't expect those to be completely independent. Like
Yeah.
I don't know, but also, and then there's all this countervailing evidence, which is the fact, like if you say that God is like counter, precisely designing the world so that veganism is good for health and good for all the things. Well, it's a little bit suspicious that he has animals not have B12, or sorry, plants not have B12, so that basically, like, unless you take a B12 supplement, you'll get like very sick. And that you also should get vitamin D. And then yeah, I'm pretty unconvinced by the examples you give. Like, I'm not a libertarian. I also think for a lot of these things, even if they're not analytically connected, they might be the types of things where you would just expect them to go together. So you might think that sort of like the reason why like suppose you falsely think that worker cooperatives are like, the best way to run an economy. I was kidding. I don't have a strong view. You might think that the reason why they both are ethical and a good way to run the economy is just that like they give workers a great degree of freedom and latitude, and then we would expect sort of like people being free to do things to in general have both positive consequences and be ethically good. So yeah, those are my worries with the argument.
Yeah, sure. Like, yeah, I kind of agree. Like, for the reasons you give, that the veganism one isn't super impressive, and also just pair that with the fact that like meat tastes really good and on average better than vegan food, and then that's like another reason why, uh, where like the facts converge, where you sort of expect it to be a little
Yeah.
bit nastier,
Okay, so
maybe.
what are the
Um,
ones you find impressive? Oh wait, sorry. One that I forgot to list that I
yeah.
think is impressive in the that like undermines the trend is like I'm very confident of the following 2 propositions. First, torture is okay in principle, and second, torture is bad in practice. And so that's like an anti-convergence. Like
Yeah.
if torture would prevent a terrorist attack from killing millions of people, right? And so I
Mhm.
I, I don't know. So what are
But
yeah? So
I
what
guess you would agree that torture is like prima facie wrong.
um
For like and for because of the torture part, and then it turns out it's also instrumentally ineffective or whatever. So there's some
Oh yeah.
convergence
I
there.
guess the view could be that it's both ineffective, but um, that it's both ineffective and prima facie. But there are lots of things that are effective that are prima facie wrong,
Yeah.
uh, like maybe like
Yeah.
taxes. Like taking people's money is like all else equal wrong. Maybe it's not wrong in normal circumstances, given what the government does with the money. But like if the government just took people's money and then burned it, that would be wrong, right?
Yeah.
So what are the
Yeah,
impressive?
so like there are none that I personally find impressive, but this is meant to be an argument that's like tailored to certain people with certain beliefs. So like I don't have strong political views. Maybe in like 10 years I'll have some view where like justice is conceived in non-consequentialist terms, and I think there's a striking correlation in general between justice and good consequences. And in that case it will move me more towards theism. But like at the moment I'm trying to sort of like get the taxonomy of like political views that fall in that bucket. Um, Dustin, as a massive lefty, can you think of any examples like in this category?
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on exactly um yeah, I mean yeah, it depends on exactly how yeah, if the question is just regardless of plausibility, what are
Mhm.
examples such that if this was true, then it would be a massive coincidence? I mean, there are, for instance, people who believe that like uh all forms of liberation struggle are inextricably linked. And so you have to be fighting racism and sexism and imperialism, etc., all at the same time, because all of these are mutually and I mean, I think that's something such that it doesn't really, I mean, sometimes there are connections. It doesn't seem plausible to me that the strong version of the view is true. Seems like often holding this view in practice makes you less effective because you can't focus on one thing at a time and specialize. And but if that is true, and it's also something that you would maybe expect to be produced by motivated reasoning, because tactically it allows you to get along with other people in your movement and say, oh, okay, I should care about your thing, you should care about mine.
Well, no,
But
I mean, God also wanted people to work together. According to scholar Dustin Crummett, and we are here to help each other. So this kind of cooperation is an important good.
Yeah, so like that's an example of a left-wing view that, like, in its strongest form, I think is just very implausible. But if it were true, then it would be in a way astonishing that, oh wow, all good political causes are mutually reinforcing, and you have to
I mean,
yeah,
maybe
that and I also was going to say, I think just similarly, popular political discourse, people are often quite unwilling to admit like drawbacks of their views. And so for those reasons, people, they think that you could do everything at the same time, it would be fine. You could fund all the things you want to fund, and you won't need to raise taxes or anything because it will just take nonprofit status away from the churches. I've never done the math on exactly how much money that will raise, but I'm sure it's enough to pay for free college and free healthcare. And so people often have implausible views about things not requiring trade-offs. And like, if you hold one of those views, then it would be astonishing that that was so. But yeah, my guess is, I mean, how many plausible views are there like this?
So like in terms of like left-wing non-consequentialist theories of justice, where like you might think some of its adherents think that imposing this justice happens to produce good consequences.
Yeah. Oh yeah, well, I mean, so I mean, maybe, if you think of Rawls, I mean, the principles of justice are not totally independent of consequences.
Yeah.
But he does sort of, I mean, part of what he's trying to argue for is the thought that you have some pre-theoretical sense of justice, and it turns out that like something basically like that is achievable under realistic conditions in the world. And this is even, in a way, by the end of his life, this is sort of how he conceived of his project, was as showing, he thought it could turn out that like a just society is just impossible. It's like realistically impossible. And if that is the case, then it will not be worthwhile for us to live upon the earth. And then it turns out at the end that it is. And he thinks that he's argued for this and shown that it is. So maybe if that's right, then this task of reconciliation to the world, of showing us that, oh no, going in, it was an open question whether justice was achievable. It turns out that it is. Maybe not by us, but by people like us at some point, in the future, under conditions like ours. That could maybe feel like a happy convergence. He has some stuff. I think there's some stuff in Justice as Fairness and the Law of Peoples where he most clearly lays out his thought of political philosophy as being partly a matter of reconciling us to the world, keeping us from giving up hope. So that could be maybe a kind of convergence that's not too maybe that's plausible, and
I mean,
Also, yeah, it didn't have to be like that.
yeah, there might be like one or two things like this, but I think if there are only a few, then the coincidence explanation
Yeah.
is better because it's just like the world has a lot of things, so you'd expect there to be some things where things nicely line up. And like, I mean, here's one going in the opposite direction that I thought of just now, where it's like, in terms of foreign policy, the following two things seem true. First, if we were able to effectively bring democracy to much of the world, if we were able to sort of like turn Iraq and Afghanistan into these flourishing, functioning democracies where everyone was wealthy and prosperous, that would be a great thing to do. And second, in practice, that works horribly, and it always turns into blood-soaked death squads, um, or like, you might think sort of like in principle, the ideal distribution of wealth would be like completely even distribution or something, but then in practice that would work out poorly.
Yeah, there is in the case of foreign policy, there is this impulse to think, oh, we have the obligation to go do a humanitarian intervention to protect people from whatever horrible atrocity. And then a bunch of the time, oh, oops, it just made things worse, you know. So that is a case where it seems like there's this prima facie obligation that is just very, very difficult to actually carry out in practice, even though it seems really important.
But like, so you might think that there's just actually like not so that there turns out not actually to be an obligation once you learn the empirical facts. Whereas like on some of the other views I'm discussing, so like take the
Yeah,
radical libertarian view, that there'll still be an obligation to stop taxing people even if the consequences are really bad. And so that's what makes
yeah,
cases like that different from the foreign policy case.
yeah,
Yeah, so like it's
yeah.
true that if
Those,
there it's just a few examples dotted around, then that's not great. But I'm thinking, okay, what if you have a view on which just like something as broad as justice is fortunately correlated with the rules of sociology and stuff. You know, that's quite a broad sweeping thing. And I think if you have a view on which that's true, then you should, after checking yourself for motivated reasoning, update in favor of theism.
yeah, yeah. It does seem like, uh, yeah. I take the point. I mean, part of the issue is just the views on which there are these like exceptionless
Yeah.
deontological principles, and they just so happen to line up with like, oh, that also maximizes GDP. And yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, those views are just obviously nuts.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, maybe there is, yeah, thinking about like the Rawlsian case.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, like the possibility of political justice. Like that's what, I mean, that's a pretty important thing, right? It's not cherry
Yeah.
picked. It's one of like a couple things maybe that are equally important or more, some things are more important
but I
maybe.
mean, I guess you might
But
think like that there's, I mean, first of all, like you might be doubtful that Rawls is right. Um, and I think I
Yeah.
would be. I haven't read Rawls very carefully. And
yeah,
then
it's
even if Rawls is right, you might think like maybe there's some other explanation where it's like um where like maybe just a part of some theory of justice being adequate is that it produces the like correct result in normal, like the correct judgments about normal cases. And then if a theory claims that basically there is justice is never achievable in normal circumstances, or achieving it would lead to disastrous consequences, well, maybe that would like count against a theory of justice.
yeah, and that's also, I mean, for Rawls, that's kind of true. So it is, there is willingness to accommodate the principles to real world conditions, which makes it
Yeah,
seem
maybe
less miraculous. Though there is, I mean, part of what is worrying Rawls is the thought that like maybe the only thing that's realistically achievable in a stable continuing way is something that's like too far from our pre-theoretical notion to like really count as a decent society. And that's what he thinks he successfully shows is not the case. But yeah,
yeah.
I'm not yeah, I'm not sold on this argument. Again, partly because of the point you make,
Yeah.
Matthew, that maybe there are just too many misses for this to be all that compelling. And
I'm not sold on the argument, but I'm sold on the argument form. Like I think there will be some people to whom this is persuasive.
Yeah,
And
it's
it's not any of us.
definitely
Yeah.
Yeah, like definitely
yeah
Walter Block or something should believe.
Yeah,
yeah
I'm gonna send this to
or
Walter
like
Block, and I expect him to write back saying he's a theist.
yeah or
Now
like
I
Ayn
think this
Rand
is a
or
remarkable argument. Nah, that was a horrible Walter
Yeah.
Block impression. I employed.
uh
Yeah, I mean,
yeah
definitely if you're like a normal like political partisan, you should be first convinced by this. It's like, what are the odds that the modern Republican Party would be right about everything?
Yeah.
what is the I mean, there must be some explanation that Aristotelians have for the unity of the virtues thesis, I guess. But
Sorry, what is the unity of the virtues?
it's the idea that like all virtues, like in fact every virtue entails every other one. You can't have any of them without having the others. They don't conflict at all, etc. So there must be some theoretical reason why that's supposed to be the case that they have. But if that's not a good reason and the unity of
Yeah.
virtues thesis is true, which it's not, but if it were, then that would also be very interesting. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, like I don't know, if this turns out to work for sort of very broad things like human
yeah,
virtue or
yeah,
justice, then I think there'll be an argument there, right? Because it's just such a
yeah,
sweeping thing that's clearly important. And yeah.
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, what one other one that counts, I think, against the thesis is just like something like at least the thesis that we have strong reasons to bring about good consequences is like obviously true. And then that thesis is like really inconvenient, and the world does not seem to be designed for us to be able to do that. Like, if you want to drive your car, you kill like thousands of insects with very clear net effect. Like I don't know, I wouldn't expect like it's weird that sort of like our common sense morality, and maybe this is just an independent argument against theism, but it's sort of like an anti-convergence where it's like our common sense
yeah,
judgments about what you should do, when you really think about them, it becomes very unclear. And then there are all these plausible stories on which maybe like everything you do is just like super unimportant compared to like a few random things. Like maybe like we should have some credence that like maybe how good of a person you are is basically just an inverse function of how many insects you kill. So I guess Dustin would be like the great guy because he's fighting for our tiny insect soldiers. Or like one that I read about that Schwitzgebel argues is maybe like you have this really strong obligations to like wear sunglasses all the time, because on many worlds every time a photon passes through the sunglasses it creates a new world. And so if like it's good to create a happy people, then like on many worlds you have like really strong reason to and then to like put on sunglasses all the time. Like if something like this might be right, and if so, this is a very like inconvenient world for us consequentialists, or at least people who think there are strong reasons to create or to like
Yeah. I think this is probably like an independent argument against theism, and it's so like I think there'll be examples where like there's a mismatch, but it's got to be fine for us to just do the thing where we're like, okay, good thing that's evidence for theism, bad thing that's evidence against theism, and I'm saying, look, good thing, broad structural thing, it's evidence for theism, and like, and there are going to be things that are evidence against theism in the
like
world as well.
it may be true that generally good things will be evidence for theism and bad things will be evidence against theism, but like they shouldn't rock the boat that much, right? So you shouldn't like see a bird outside and be like, oh, that's a good bird. Credence and theism up 5%. Like,
Yeah, which is why it's like a broad thing, not just like a
yeah,
particular
yeah,
instance of a good thing.
yeah. But I guess, yeah, I'm very suspicious of this argument. And I think, if anything, I would say considerations surrounding this count against theism. Though I agree, if you have various crazy views, you should be convinced by this.
Yeah.
One other argument, or well, do we have more to say on this argument? Because I have another argument for God that I came across.
Oh
Actually,
wow. Yeah, I feel like we've covered everything. Where like the argument probably shouldn't persuade anyone, but in fact, if they have the right views, it should persuade them.
yeah, okay. So it's the argument from conscience, where but it's sort of like a moral knowledge argument where the idea, so maybe an atheist can tell a plausible story, and I don't think they can without invoking like special psychophysical laws uh, of how we come to know um, the moral facts, sort of like similarly to how we come to know the mathematical facts, just we're like these rational creatures who can figure things out. We have beautiful big brains. But that doesn't predict that our conscience would line up with the moral facts, where like maybe we would abstractly figure out that X is right, but that doesn't predict that sort of like the things that that just like emotionally resonate us would correlate with morality. And so if this is right, then I think atheists, there's like a debunking account for maybe for like atheists relying on their conscience. Now I might say, okay, conscience just like isn't that reliable. What we should rely on is our sort of like moral reflections. And you can say, you know, our conscience are sort of like, you know, the things that pull on our heartstrings. Those were mostly selected for by evolution, and they, you know, they're not great at tracking the moral facts. And you can give this evolutionary explanation. But first of all, even with the evolutionary explanation, like it's not guaranteed, you know, like I think, you know, if octopi had been the smart creatures to evolve, they wouldn't have had the same kinds of moral intuitions. They're much more solitary, etc. And also, if you have this view on which sort of like what matters is just what you think about morally rather than your conscience, then this might sort of lead to like some weird moral conclusions where like, you know, imagine, you know, like some utilitarian comes up with some crazy argument for like why you should go around like hitting babies with hammers or something because it like maximizes expected utility. They give some argument for this. Like I think most people would say that you're still, even if you sort of like don't thinking about like you should rely on sort of your like, you know, your conscience to tell you, you know, you shouldn't do that. But if your conscience is unreliable, then it's a bit hard to see why you should trust it. So the idea is that even aside from the moral knowledge problem, there's the problem of just sort of like our emotional reactions to various moral situations. There's the problem of like that lines up with the moral facts.
I guess it doesn't seem that I mean, once you have some explanation to the moral knowledge problem, presumably in terms of like evolution, somehow or other winding up selecting for, you know, are having certain moral intuitions. Won't it then be very easy to have an evolutionary explanation of why evolution also selected for like those intuitions also being backed up by strong emotional reactions?
Yeah. Like I'm thinking, you know, so the emotions here are functioning as a kind of moral failsafe where even if you don't see the moral facts, they still pull on your heartstrings. So they're kind of like moral heuristics that like operate independently of the reason that of like the reason that you're aware of consciously. But then it's like, okay, just take an analogy with like mathematics, there are going to be kind of mathematical heuristics that we automatically rely on, where we don't sort of see the mathematical facts, we just kind of do the reasoning. And like if you have some explanation of mathematical knowledge, then like it's not going to be hard to get the heuristics on top of that.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, I would think like moral emotions probably predate moral knowledge, because it seems like animals, lots of animals that probably don't have explicit moral beliefs, you know, still have beliefs that promote, you know, they love their children and they are loyal to members of their pack and all that sort of stuff. So if anything, you might think that like the thing that came first and that's always been motivationally most powerful are the emotional reactions. And you know, that's if you have in anything that would allow you to explain how it is that we wind up with like vaguely correct moral intuitions, you know, really the emotions are the much more evolutionarily salient thing.
Sorry, I was just going to say I have the reactive attitude of disgust at this argument.
Yeah, I guess so I mean, I don't like there are cases where your conscience and your moral intuitions diverge. Like sort of like, imagine that I was in a situation in one of those weird utilitarian scenarios where utilitarianism instructs you to do actions that like, most people think are wrong. Like my conscience would tell me one thing and my sort of reflective moral judgment would be another thing.
Yeah.
And so I disagree with you, Amos, that it's just sort of like it's just a matter of our conscience is sort of this like, level one version of our moral intuitions. I guess in terms of your point, Dustin, that once you have an account of our moral intuitions, that accounts for our conscience. I guess it'll be harder to do that because like so I think the only remotely plausible thing to say is to say that somehow we get the ability to like grasp the moral facts, where you don't want to just say it's like a coincidence that the moral facts and our moral beliefs line up. I think you want to say somehow we have the ability to sort of like to believe that X is wrong because in fact X is wrong.
Yeah.
But then that won't apply to our conscience. Just to be clear, I'm not super sold on this argument. Maybe it's like
Yeah.
C tier or something. But
I guess I don't quite, I mean, what is the force of so we can return to that in a minute, but the force of the person in the weird utilitarian scenario, their conscience is going to diverge from their reflective judgment. That's true. And that happens all the time. But I mean, often, I guess whether it's good or bad that happens just depends on how good your reflective judgment is. I mean, this is why
mine's very good.
this is why people don't give money to effective altruist charities and whatever. Instead give to things that have personal connections to and stuff. Wait, maybe that's not relevant. Is the point just that there is this
The
distinction
point is,
between like the moral the emotional aspect and the cognitive judgment?
uh, yeah, and I think that there's a important distinction between like I think conscience. Amos was suggesting that our moral conscience is a little bit similar to our sort of like level one, is our like system one response to mathematical problems, where you just sort of see it and then you have like you think about that it is some particular thing quickly. Like, when you hear 7 times 7, you think 49 immediately. And I'm suggesting that I think our conscience is this sort of distinct process. And so then it's suspicious that our conscience ends up mostly lining up with the moral facts. Like you could have just imagined all these nearby possible worlds where like, maybe reflectively we think lots of things about morality, but we end up just like our moral conscience ends up pointing us, like we just don't have very much sympathy for anyone except those who are very, very close to us. Now, you might think, it is still, I think, a problem for theism, at least, some evidence against theism that our moral conscience isn't good enough, where it's like lots of people are like not effective altruists, for example. They make these crazy errors. Um, but like yeah, I guess it is suspicious that that it lines up pretty well. And if it didn't line up well, that would be disastrous, because it seems like people basically never act based on what their reflective moral judgment is, and only act based on some combination of like social pressure and their like gut feelings about morality. And so then it's like, given that, it's very good news that our gut feelings tend to be mostly right.
Yeah, I guess I mean my thought with respect to the moral knowledge problem has always been that I'm kind of happy with some evolutionary psychology-esque explanation of how we wound up with our intuitions and or like our basic evaluative dispositions, at least, that issue later in intuitions about more specific things. And I guess I'm thinking once that story is in place, then like it's going to be even easier for evolution to provide an explanation of our emotional judgments. And in both cases, there's something there's something maybe suspicious about the fact that the evolutionary forces were such as to produce dispositions that align with objective morality to some tolerably good extent. But like beyond that, it doesn't seem to me that there's any deep problem about why evolution also provided us with these emotional responses.
Yeah,
Like
I
it would
don't
be
I
it would
don't
be
think
it would be
that's
weirder. Yeah, it would be weirder if it didn't actually, or if it gave us ones that were wildly divergent. But
yeah,
go
I
on.
mean uh yeah, I mean I guess I would okay, so I don't agree with the standard evolutionary psychology picture, right? I think so. Like, my view is the way we come to have our moral beliefs is that, there are these psychophysical laws which enable us to be these sort of rational agents who can think about things and figure them out. And so evolution doesn't select for our moral beliefs directly, but what evolution gives us is, I mean, it selects for some of them certainly, but it selects for, us having these, us being these sort of free agents who can think about the moral facts and then figure them out. And so then I think that explains a lot of our moral beliefs.
Yeah.
And so if that's right, but at the very least, I think conditional on atheism, it's hard to see how you get an explanation of why our moral beliefs line up with the moral facts. Now, I think the only plausible route for the atheist that's at all plausible is just to either accept some expanded thing like axiarchism, or to accept that sort of like the psychophysical law, agree with a theist about the psychophysical laws, but just say, okay, these are just basic psychophysical laws that give rise to agents. But if that's true, that's the only plausible route for the atheist, well, maybe us being sort of these libertarian agents, and I don't know if you necessarily have to be a libertarian, but us, these agents who can sort of think about the moral facts and come to believe things about morality because they're true. If that's the explanation of how we come to have these moral beliefs, then that doesn't explain why our sort of like conscience lines up with the morality. Just like our conscience surrounding calculus doesn't line up with like the calculus related facts. The moral stuff could have been some more. And if you think there's a picture of how we come to.
Do you want to deny the evolutionary psychology type explanation of our moral emotions?
No, I think what you'd want to say is that the explanation of our moral emotions is the evolutionary psychology explanation, but it's that sort of God made them that way. He sort of set them up so that our moral emotions would be made up to track the truth.
Yeah, and so the reason you're viewing this as a distinct problem because you think there's a different explanation in the case of our moral beliefs and intuitions, whereas I was viewing these as like rough. I see. Yeah, maybe if you hold that view, yeah, maybe there is a problem there that motivates something.
Yeah. Okay, I can talk about another argument for theism. I have to go not that distantly, but there's another one I've been thinking about. If you all have time to, okay, it's speaking of if you have time, it's just the argument from time, where it's like time's this weird thing. It's needed for like anything good to happen. Like, if there weren't time, things would just statically sit there doing nothing. Now, okay, maybe God is timeless and something to think about how, but like it's at least at least the probability of there being time conditional on theism is very high. But then time is just this bizarre and very specific thing, too strange to be part of the fabric of reality, to quote Mackey. And so, like, God's the best explanation of why there's time.
Does Augustine have some argument like this?
I would absolutely not know.
There's some point where he talks about not understanding what time is. Maybe it doesn't turn out to be an argument for theism. I can't remember.
Yeah, right. So like I guess there'll be some views on which time is contingent and it's more likely to exist if theism is true because it makes possible a bunch of other good things. So yeah. I mean like it'll work on those views and then on views on which time is necessary. Will it work on those? I mean, I'm not sure. So like yeah, so like you might think I don't know if time is necessary, it could still be a necessity that's explained by some other necessity. And like God being a necessary being beneath it makes it more probable because like something about his nature would just entail the existence of time. I don't know, but
I mean, time being
uh,
necessary, I don't know. That seems like a kind of weird view. Maybe is this like a popular view? Time's necessary.
um, semi view and like I mean like lots of theists think it's necessary.
Well, I mean, don't theists think that generally that God is outside of time? That God sort of like
Like only the ones who think God is outside of time. I mean, like Ryan Mullins, for example, thinks that time is a divine attribute, and there are like pantheists and panentheists, and like lots of them will think time is necessary, where like
Well,
God
if you
sort of
think
necessarily, yeah,
if you think time is necessary because God like
because of God,
necessarily yeah, then you could
right,
say, well, if counter possibly God didn't exist, time would be merely contingent, and
yeah. That was the
fine.
that was the point I was making about like how
Yeah,
it could still count on views on which time is necessary
yeah.
because it's explained by God. But I don't know enough about philosophy of time to know like what um most normies think about this.
I mean, it seems, I guess, like the fact that time moves at different speeds depending on your like reference frame, that seems hard to square with time being necessary. Like, would it be necessarily time exists, but that what it does depends on the things. I guess you can also make, even if you think time is necessary, maybe you think that the fact that there are sort of interactions between stuff and time. Well, that's a weird way of phrasing it, but stuff that the laws make reference to time, right? So stuff sort of like evolves over time is like more strongly predicted on theism. I mean, maybe that's just an element of having laws.
Yeah.
Wow. So what do we think? God exists or?
Yeah. Yeah, God
Uh,
exists.
yeah, that's true. I'm not sure if
Yeah.
it's shown to be true by
Because
any
of
of
time. Yeah.
these three arguments, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think I like the time one the best of the arguments that we've covered in this.
Yeah, I think they're getting better over time. It's like the time one's the
Uh,
best,
uh,
then mine is the second best. Or the like, what was the middle one that we were talking about?
The ideological fine-tuning argument for like partisans with suspiciously convenient beliefs.
Oh yeah, I think that one was the worst.
Yeah.
That one should
So like
convince you.
only for you. I think like most like yeah like I don't know just like a large number of people like outside of philosophy as well will just have sort of weird like suspiciously convenient beliefs which are like almost definitely because of motivated reasoning, but if they take themselves not to be motivated then like they should update.
yeah, it is it's an argument that should convince all and only irrational people,
Yeah.
basically. So it's
Yeah.
sort of it's hard to know what to make of that.
Yeah, but I bet
Uh,
those guys won't be convinced by it.
yeah. It's like if you had yeah, that's true. Yeah, the thing is if you're irrational enough to hold these beliefs anyway, then you're irrational enough to just not acknowledge the problem.
I think I could get people on the street to acknowledge the problem. This would be my soapbox argument. I would say uh, I would just like ask people their political views and show how
This
they
is yeah,
find theism.
this is what you'll say with a megaphone in
Yeah,
Hyde Park or whatever.
yeah.
No,
Yeah.
you're like playing both sides where you're like talking to a liberal and a conservative, and you're like, isn't it suspicious that the Democrat Party gets everything right? And then you like turn to the conservative and you're like, yeah, the Democrats are wrong about everything. The best explanation of that
Yeah.
is that they're getting their marching orders from Satan.
No, and like I'll say to the Republicans, isn't it coincidence that they're right about everything and they're led by the second incarnation of Jesus Christ? I mean that's very surprising on atheism.
Yeah, I think Cameron would like that argument. I think One argument that I came across recently.
the Eliakim typological argument for Trump 2024.
Yeah, I think actually Amos Catholics should be very convinced by your argument because it's like it's a big coincidence that the Catholic Church is just right in all of their infallible statements. What are the odds?
They already think that there's a theistic explanation of that, right?
Yeah.
So,
So like I guess it would be an argument addressed to atheist Christians. So like you go into an Anglican church and you'd be like, isn't it surprising that everything the Anglican church teaches is right if there is no God?
Yeah, one argument that
like, wow, I never thought about that.
One argument that I found convincing that I recently came across from someone called Florence on Twitter is that I think theism is the best explanation of the fact that Jesus spoke not like the scribes and Pharisees, but as one possessing authority.
Yeah, Florence's series of tweets in this genre are just absolute gold, and people fall for them every time.
Yeah, I started making some tweets that were in a similar genre, where it was atheism taken to its logical implication implies, and then various funny things. So one of them was atheism taken to its logical conclusion implies that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, which I thought was funny, but the reaction was not as positive. How do atheists explain the fact that the world was created in 6 days and God rested on the 7th? There's not a good naturalistic account of that at all.
It's true.
Yeah. Okay, last argument. Okay, and then I'll probably have so you know there's Cutter and Sads or Sod or whatever. How's it pronounced? Anyone know?
I don't know.
I'm sad that I don't know. Their argument from nomological harmony. I think I mentioned this briefly to Dustin before, but so you know, suppose that. So one point they make, even aside from the nomological harmony argument, is they say that the powers view avoids the most straightforward version of the argument. Sorry, for those who don't know, the nomological harmony argument is the idea that it's a big coincidence that not only the laws that apply to the universe apply to the stuff that exists, right? So you could have had the laws say all Y's do Z, but then all the fundamental stuff just be X's, and so you know nothing happens. And so he says, you know, suppose you have what's called the powers view, where you think that the fundamental laws really they don't describe like these things that govern and make the particles do stuff. They just describe the powers of the fundamental stuff. So when you say there's a law of gravity, what you really mean is that all the you know stuff with mass has the power to attract the other stuff with mass, and then you give a description of the powers. And what they say is that, well, this solves the original problem. It doesn't solve the second problem, which is that it's a big coincidence that the powers that things have happen to interact with other stuff, right? So you could have only X's, and all the X's they say they all interact with Y's in various ways, but there aren't any Y's, so they just sit there doing nothing. So it's a big coincidence that the stuff that there is happens to have the causal powers to interact with the other stuff that there is. But I just think the second challenge would just be applied to any view about laws, where it's just like, it is a big coincidence that the fundamental stuff, whatever it is, that it, you know, on any account, it does certain stuff. And so it's a big coincidence that the stuff it does, the conditions under which it does stuff are whatever the initial conditions of the universe were. That'll apply whether you think that the laws are governing, whether you're a Humean, whether you think that the powers view is correct. Are you all silent after your mind has been blown?
I think I've weighed in on this before, haven't I?
Yeah. But I think you said you agree, right? I remember correctly.
I think that's the best of the arguments that we have heard today.
Wow. There's also psychophysical harmony.
Yeah, that's the best of the arguments that we
Second.
haven't heard today.
Second.
It might be
I don't know about that.
behind. Yeah, it might be behind just some sort of well, you know, the a priori fine-tuning argument or something.
Yeah, I think probably a priori fine tuning is number one. Like it's just the most like straightforward, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
Doesn't even rely on any controversial conclusions.
yeah.
So yeah, then I think number two is of course the anthropic argument, and then number three is the psychophysical harmony, and then it's the moral argument from objective
And
moral.
Lewis's argument from desire. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Should we wrap up, I guess?
Yeah.
All right.
Toodaloo.
Bye.
By the way, God exists.